Hello, and welcome to the Psych and Business Podcast, where we highlight the integration of psychology and psychological principles into the world of business and organizations. I'm your host, Dr. Ernest Wayde. I have a really great guest for you today. Her name is Dr. Sherry Buffington, and she's a motivational and performance psychologist. Sherry is also an author, a speaker, a presenter, and developer of multiple programs to help leaders and teams optimize performance, productivity, and profits. Sherry, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Sherry, I'm so glad to have you here. You're such a unique character, especially as someone who focuses on motivational and performance. And usually we see that with sports, but you do that in the business world. So tell us, how did you become a psychologist that focused on motivation and performance focused around business?
When I was studying psychology, I also was studying nonverbal communications. I was working my way through college. That was my second round of college um, by doing training at a corporate
Mm-hmm.
levels. And I was at the time using off the shelf assessments and also studying nonverbal communications, and people were telling me um, very different things non-verbally than often they were telling me on paper. So
Yeah.
that's how one of the assessments that I developed, core map, came to be, is that I wanted to understand why their nonverbals were different than their verbals.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I got into that arena mostly because I had individuals who owned small businesses, and they were going, well, can you help us make our team better? Can you help us know how to build this company?
Mm-hmm.
From a
Mm-hmm.
psychological standpoint. My first program was called the Psychology of Superior Selling. And so it was clear that I was going from a psychological standpoint
Mm-hmm.
versus the typical business avenue.
Yeah.
And that's I had a lot of interest. So people who attended that first seminar, the Psychology of Superior Selling, were going, well, does psychology work in other areas? Well, of course it does.
Mm-hmm.
I began focusing on performance because performance is my area. Began focusing on performance in the workplace because one of the major complaints that I got from leaders is that people weren't performing to the level they expected they would. The often the complaint was they look good coming in the door, but then they don't perform. After 2 or 3 months, they're not performing. Well, there are reasons for that.
Mm-hmm.
I started researching why. Why does that occur? Why do they come in the door full of enthusiasm and that wanes, and then they're not very effective at that, from down the road?
Mm-hmm.
There are two factors for that, as I discovered. One is the leadership style,
Mm.
which is vitally important. The other is job fit, and most organizations look at job fit, but they don't look at the other two factors. So leadership style, very important, job fit, and culture fit. And so I've seen people shine in one organization
Mm-hmm.
and just fall flat on their face in another.
So when you say
And
leadership style, you're talking about the style of the leader that they're going to be working underneath. Is that right?
that the leader they work underneath, as well as the top guy,
Okay.
the CEO. In most organizations, there's an axiom that says, "As the leader goes, the organization goes."
Mm-hmm.
That's true because the CEO is the one who determines what the culture looks like,
Right.
and the one who determines what leader is in what department,
Mm-hmm.
right? They are the ones who determine what they will accept within their workplace and what they won't accept.
So they set the standard and the example for leaders. For leaders. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, absolutely. And if they're not really aware of what the culture they want to build and the leadership styles that work within particular teams. So, teams, for example, if I have a team whose goal is to increase sales, I need a different mix of team members, right, for that
Mm-hmm.
team,
Mm-hmm.
because well, than for a team whose goal is to improve IT. Whole different
Right.
team
That's where
goal.
the fit comes
If a,
into play. Mm-hmm.
exactly, if a leader, it's not just fit for the job; it's also fit for the
Mm-hmm.
team. So if leaders aren't aware of that, then they're not putting leaders in those particular teams that lead those types of people
Mm-hmm.
well.
Mm-hmm.
So can have a mismatch between your team, like an IT team. If you had an IT team and a leader who would actually be good over in the sales team, there's a mismatch. They don't communicate
Right.
with each other.
Because the people
Um,
in those teams have different needs, have different functions, and also operate differently. So the leader needs to fit the group as well, is what I'm hearing.
they think differently, they communicate differently. One of the major complaints I hear as far as gaps in an organization is the gap between people who are technical, the IT kinds of
Mm-hmm.
people, and general managers, the people-centric people,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
They just don't have the same language. Um, but I got into organizational performance as a result of that was the easy thing to get into when I was to work my way, fund my way through college,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
But I found people in general and people in the workplace, my ideal market is what I call dedicated doers.
Say more
And of
about
course,
that. What does
that,
that What does that mean? What does that look like?
uh, well, you see dedicated doers in the sports world, obviously. They're dedicated to performance, right?
Right.
But in the work world, the same is true. They're either dedicated to high performance or they're not. They're dedicated to doing a good job and going the extra mile or they're not.
Mm-hmm.
Leaders are dedicated to learning what it takes to be a great leader or they're not.
Mm.
I have found in organizations, all organizations, there are four cultures that exist, just four. Only one of them's healthy. Three are unhealthy. And so you have no consequences. In a no consequence culture, people get by with things they shouldn't get by with.
Mm-hmm.
So the slacker gets the same consideration as the high performer, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a no mistakes culture. And in that culture, if you make a mistake, people get called out of the carpet, usually in public, among their team members for the mistake. So in a no consequences culture, what happens is the best people, the best workers, get frustrated and they leave.
Mm.
So you end up with underperformers, right?
Yeah.
In a no consequence
Right.
culture. In a no mistakes culture, people don't dare innovate. They don't dare do anything new or innovative because innovation by its very nature has
Mm.
mistakes, right?
And mistakes
And
are
so they don't
punished
want to do that.
harshly. Yeah.
They're punished harshly. And the third one is a firefighter culture. And in a firefighter culture, everybody's putting out fires all the time, including the CEO,
Mm-hmm.
including the C-level executives. So those are all of those cultures are unhealthy. And I've actually been in organizations where all three of those cultures exist,
Mm.
depending on the department, right?
Yeah.
There's only one healthy culture, and I call that structured freedom. That's an environment where there's enough structure. People know what will get them in trouble, what won't.
Mm-hmm.
They know what will get them rewarded, what will create a punishment. They know that it's clear. And within that culture, they are free to function at their highest level.
Mm-hmm.
They become self-motivated and self-driven and high performance, which eases the burden for leaders by a long shot. They don't need as much time or energy to manage their people because their people are self-managed in that culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, are you familiar with Good to Great, the book Good to
Yes.
Great?
Yeah. Great book.
Uh, when I read that book, because of the assessment that I developed and have been using for years, I realized that what he described as a level 5 leader was actually an opposition. So something had to be between. So, example, they made hard decisions, right? They were decisive and made the hard decisions,
Mm-hmm.
but they were also humble, right? And people centered.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going, oh, so humility is one type of individual, a humble person, and a driven person that makes hard decisions is a different type of person,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I wanted to know what was between that, and I did a study based on his description of level 5 leaders and discovered that in healthy cultures, they literally do those leaders literally have a structured freedom culture and they have a mindset that he describes beautifully, which is uh, level 5 leaders, what I call VIP leaders,
Mm-hmm.
visionary, influential, progressive. Um, the analogy he uses is great leaders, when things go right, they look out the window and say, my people did that.
Mm-hmm.
And when things go wrong, they look in the mirror and say, what could I have done
Yeah.
differently? Poor leaders do the opposite. They look out the window when things go wrong and they say, my people created that problem,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they look in the mirror when things go right and they go, aren't I wonderful? I did. Uh, and and that's kind of an interesting mark for leadership.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
are they giving their people credit where credit is due, and are they looking at themselves when things go wrong to say, what can I do
Mm-hmm.
differently?
Mm-hmm. Now, Sherry, I know that you do a lot of work with motivation, and your psychological background has really influenced your approach. Talk a little bit about how really leverage motivation and psychology and psychological principles in really helping to develop this healthy culture that you've talked about.
Well, there are two forms of motivation: intrinsic and extrinsic. Many organizations focus on extrinsic motivators,
Mm-hmm.
paychecks, incentives,
Yeah.
bonuses. The problem with those is that they are expensive to maintain, and they get more expensive, and they don't last very long.
Mm-hmm.
So, an example of that is, and I've seen organizations that do this, they give someone a bonus when they have a good year.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the next year they don't have quite as good a year, so they don't give a bonus, or they give a lesser bonus. Well, the people now think, why, there's something wrong with the company, there's something wrong with me, there's something wrong, right? Because the bonus isn't the same or better than the year before.
Mm-hmm.
So then it becomes a demotivator. Intrinsic motivation is all about psychology.
Mm-hmm.
It's all that,
Yeah.
it's it is what makes you happy, what excites you, what what are your interests, what do you find enjoyable
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
do. And if leaders are looking at that, if they're looking at, how do I put an individual in a job that they have natural talents for, that they enjoy doing, right? That they have a lot of energy around. So I have a graph I call the energy effort
Mm-hmm.
graph. And we're all hardwired for our core nature. And our core nature allows us to be energized by certain behaviors, certain functions, and drained by others. And if you think about things that energize you, when you're functioning according to those things, you can do things all day long, and you have to kind of wind down at the end of the day,
Yeah.
right? Because you have energy left
Yeah.
over. And then there are things that are necessary for you to do that drain you.
Mm-hmm.
So if we look at that spectrum, for me, what energizes me is interacting with people and researching and discovering new things and learning. I'm energized by that.
Mm-hmm.
I can do that all day long.
Yeah.
I don't like handling rote, repetitious detail. I can do that for about 2 hours and I'm drained, right? If if leaders don't understand that about their people, they can put people who have a lot of talent
Mm-hmm.
in a job that's draining. And I equate that to swimming upstream. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't matter how good a swimmer you are. If I throw you into a swift river and I tell you your job is to swim against the current,
Yeah.
you can swim as hard as you want to swim, and you're not going to get very far. And at the end of that, not getting very far, you're going to be
Yeah.
exhausted.
Yeah, I really
That's the same.
appreciate what you're saying, Sherry, especially because I've had some of this experience myself. I think I might have mentioned to you that I was in a job prior where I was getting a lot of extrinsic motivation, and getting rewarded for the work that I was doing, but there was something that was missing, and that was that intrinsic motivation for the work. And I really came to a point where the two were in conflict, and I had to decide: is the extrinsic motivation enough, or do I need to do something else to make sure that I'm speaking to that intrinsic motivation? So I definitely appreciate what you're saying and how this can impact performance.
Well, and your experience is a really good example. It happens all the time. So um, leaders often look at people who are unmotivated and they go, well, we'll increase their salary, or we'll give them a trip,
Hmm.
or we'll give. I was talking to a friend just recently. He said he got a watch for something. He said, one, I don't wear watches, and I don't, you know, and I don't even like, this is an analog watch, and I don't like this. If I was going to get a watch, it would be a digital, not analog, right?
Hmm.
So he was not only was he not motivated, he was actually irritated by it.
Yeah.
So it was the assumption that an extrinsic motivator is going to make you happier, get more out of you. And what you just described is, at some point, the money just isn't
Hmm.
enough.
Hmm.
The perks aren't enough. You know, if you're not, if you don't have the joy, if you don't have the
Yeah.
satisfaction, right? You can only do it for so
Yeah.
long. And
Absolutely.
it's
It's
that swim,
the joy, right?
right?
I think that's what's really important is if you don't have the joy, it's harder to do and you can only do it for so long. Share how
Yeah.
do leaders identify some of these intrinsic motivations? Because I think some of the challenges that I know leaders have is it's easier to focus on the extrinsic because those are just easier to do and to give. How does a leader identify intrinsic motivators so that they can actually speak to those of their individuals and assign them appropriately?
Well, there are several levels of motivation. One is what I call basic motivation. All humans need it. So basic motivation, I arranged it so that it actually spells out basic.
Hmm.
So belonging, um, was the
Hmm.
acceptance. B is belonging. A is acceptance. C is consideration.
Hmm.
I or S is significance. Um, identity, and C is consideration.
Okay.
So they need belonging, acceptance, significance, identity, and consideration. Those are broad based beliefs. We all need those,
Hmm.
right? Would you agree that you need all those? We, if we didn't have those basic needs, we couldn't be conditioned any other way except through physical punishment.
Right. Those are just
But
socially.
then
So
you have
yeah.
to
Hmm.
narrow it down. In the workplace, you needed to narrow it down. Now, the next level of motivators are broad based beliefs, our
Hmm.
values. So, and those happen generationally. So my generation and your generation are different, and I have different um, basic values than you do, and you have different basic values than Gen Z
Hmm.
does today, right? Generations, our cohorts um, shape our values, and values are another. If we can meet people's value systems, that's another motivator.
Hmm.
So we need to generations to know what they need and what's important to them. Those are general values. Then, if we look down even closer, now we look at individual needs. So, individually, we have, based on how we're hardwired,
Hmm.
what our core basic needs is. We have needs, and again, it's that some things drive
Yeah.
us, energize us, some things drain us,
So
right? And if we
so
understand the
let me make
needs
sure
that,
that I'm understanding this correctly. So the first one we talked about those basic needs, which are more societal in their description, and then we go down to more of the generational needs, making sure that you're identifying the generational the members of the different generations that you're working with, so that you can understand their motivations before you go down to the individual needs. Did I identify those correctly? Okay.
yes, and if you look at that, they're easier need. The basic needs are easier to see.
Hmm.
You don't do a lot of research to look at basic needs. They're basic human needs. We have to do some research, generational research, right,
Hmm.
to know what generationally. So if I know your generation and you know mine,
Hmm.
we can now do research and say what are the general values for that
Hmm.
generation, right?
Hmm.
So they're so for example, millennials have a high work life
Hmm.
balance value. You know, they're not going baby boomers, my generation, didn't have that.
Right.
We were taught by our traditional parents that you work
Work
hard and you
hard.
work hard and you
Yeah.
work hard, right?
You'll enjoy your life later. Yeah.
The thing is, we didn't teach our children that, right? We bought into it ourselves, but we didn't teach our children.
Yeah.
So Gen X and millennials don't have
Hmm.
that need, work life balance. Um, and then in order to get more specific, we've got to look closer. We've got to look at the individual. We've got to look at you and what you need and what drives you and what energizes you and what interests you.
Hmm.
Now I've got to look at my team members individually. So I've got to look
Yeah.
closer to know what motivates
So this really
my team.
requires leaders to work a lot harder than they used to, right? As you're saying with baby boomers, it was you didn't really have to focus too much because they were all just the generation just worked really hard and worked required just did what was needed, right? But nowadays there was a more of focus on, as you said, work life balance, and so the workforce just is asking for different things. Even now, a lot of employees want to work virtually, and so those are things that are different motivators, and so leaders really have to really understand and work harder to make sure that they're meeting the needs of their workforce.
Right. And the interesting thing is, if you look at millennials, I did some, in fact, wrote a book, but did a lot of research around Gen X and
Hmm.
millennials. And now I'm adding Gen Z, but what motivates baby
Hmm.
boomers and, and traditionals before baby boomers, there was a work ethic, right? And that work ethic was, like you said, you just work until the day's over, and if you have to work extra, you work extra. That's what's expected of you.
Hmm.
Nobody questioned. Starting with Gen Z and especially millennials, that whole thing shifted. Millennials, you are a millennial, I presume.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And we're not saying that millennials and Gen Z don't work hard. We're just saying that their
Oh, they
priorities
do.
are different, right? I think it's
Their
important to
priorities
clarify
are
that
very.
distinction.
So there's a really fascinating thing in the research I did around millennials. I discovered something very fascinating, and it's a huge complaint of leaders, but they don't understand why it's happening. We learned, my generation and the generation before me, learned winning and losing from war and sports. And in war and sports, you stay with it. You stay with it until the end, even if you're losing, right? That's not how millennials learned about those kinds of. They learned from video games, and in video games, if you are losing, you abort, reset, go back and figure out a new strategy, right, and go again. They're doing the same things in the workplace. So they go into a workplace, and if the culture isn't working for them, and if leadership isn't working for them, and they try, they'll try what they can to make it work. And if it doesn't work, they abort. I've had leaders tell me that they've had millennials leave like they're going to the bathroom, and they just never come back. Reset, abort, reset, right? Learn what didn't work there, go find. And I've asked them, what keeps you in a job? What keeps you in a company? They want to have conversations. They want to have a relationship with the leaders. They don't want to be a number, right? And they say, if I could find a place where I was considered as a human being, where there was work life balance, where um, the we're considered as in the right job, et cetera, et cetera, I would stay. That feel like home. So they're essentially describing structured freedom, where I had the freedom to perform, and I knew what would get me in trouble and what wouldn't, and I had the freedom to have relationships with the people I work with. They would stay. Also, if I'm continually learning, I want to be learning. I want to be learning and growing, not just business wise, but personal wise. I want that. I want it to be an experience where I feel like I'm gaining something.
So this is really interesting, Sherry, because what I'm hearing you say is that the millennials have different values, which I think is well known in that different generations have different values. But what we also know about millennials is that they're less likely to stay in a position if their values aren't being met, right? If their value system it isn't the same as the organization. And so what you're saying is that research shows that that's because of the way in which they were able to help me understand it with the video game.
Because when you're playing a video game, do you play video games?
Yes.
When you're playing a video game and you keep running into the same problem over and over and
Hmm.
over, you quit, you abort, you go back, you figure out what needs to be done. If even if you have to go to a cheat sheet, right, and figure out what's creating this issue, you'll do that, and then you go back and you go again.
Okay.
Millennials. are often treating a job that same way. There's another factor too. They'd just as soon be an independent contractor as an employee,
Hmm. Hmm.
because in a contractor they feel like they have more power and more voice. So they're after a voice. They're not after money. Another fascinating thing with millennials, that generation, and Gen Z too, money's not a motivator. They're not opposed to they expect to have 12 to 15 jobs in their lifetime.
Hmm.
That, in my generation, that was a stigma. If you had more than 5 jobs, there's something wrong with you. That's
Hmm.
not true.
Hmm.
So that leaving a job for another one is not a stigma for them.
Okay.
They're not money motivated. They figure, I had a job, I was looking for a job and I found this one, I can look for another one.
Hmm.
And so the things that leaders who learned leadership, and unfortunately most leadership training goes all the way back to the traditional leadership style. If they believe that money is the motivator, and they're giving raises or bonuses or awards or whatever,
Hmm.
doesn't motivate the newer generations, millennials and Gen Z. Doesn't motivate them.
Yeah, the extrinsic rewards aren't as motivating as those intrinsic values that they have, that millennials have. Hmm. Yeah.
And it's always been true, but it's more true for millennials and Gen Z now. It's more true because they aren't concerned about leaving a job. They aren't concerned about going home and living with mom and dad if they have to until they find another job.
Mm.
So it's a whole new world,
Yeah.
and motivation is understanding what will motivate them is vitally important to have good employees.
Yeah, I think you make a really great point in that understanding the motivation of the people that you're working with or that you're leading as a leader is really critical, because without that motivation, it's going to be really hard to, make sure that they're rightly positioned in order to make sure that they're performing as best as they can, which can influence the organization as a whole. So I think it's really important, as you said, to really make sure that you're understanding the motivation. And I like the structure that you outlined, starting with the basic, and then the generational, and then working on the individual. I think that's a really great framework to help leaders try to better understand some of those motivations of their employees.
And if you understand the needs behind so for example, your energy tells me that you lead with commander, what I call commander. So CORMAT, the assessment I developed, is commander, organizer, relator, and entertainer.
Hmm.
We know what those people look like, right?
Hmm.
Commanders need action, they need results, they need accomplishment,
Hmm.
they need autonomy, they need to feel like they're in control of their own outcomes, right? And when those things aren't being met, they start pushing harder for those needs and they get tested.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it moves from positive behavior to mid-zone coping behavior to negative behavior.
Hmm.
And then that awesome employee coming in the door starts looking pretty negative. But it's because their needs aren't being
Yeah.
met. So if we understand the needs behind what the core style of an individual, and we're helping them get their needs met, we love people who help us get our needs met. You know, when someone is frustrating you and preventing you from accomplishing your goals, right? When someone is going too slow or they're being too clueless, right? How's that affect you?
Yeah, that's, you're making a good point, right? If you aren't getting your needs met from somebody, from the people that you're working with, or the leader that's in charge, it's really hard to stay motivated yourself and to have the energy to be effective and efficient. Yeah.
Say you have a leader that micromanages. What's the effect of micromanagement on someone who likes autonomy and to accomplish like you do?
That's very stifling and very frustrating. I think that's one of the things that I don't like micromanagers, and I don't like to micromanage. That's not something that I enjoy. Either one, doing it or receiving it.
Exactly. And there's a fascinating thing that happens in the brain. All humans do it when stress goes up.
Hmm.
And if needs are being frustrated or not met, stress goes up.
Hmm.
And as stress goes up, what happens is the amygdala, the part of your brain that manages
Hmm.
stress,
Hmm.
that's manages that fight, flight, or
Yeah.
freeze, is stress, especially prolonged stress, as a threat. And so it fires up and starts burning up energy to manage a threat. And what happens to balance? The brain is an energy conservationist. And in order to balance that energy drain that's happening in the amygdala, what it does is reduce the function of the prefrontal cortex.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that happens to be the center of all executive
Yep.
functions: clear thinking, problem solving, planning, strategizing, all the things we need to be effective employees,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, what typically happens is when those functions reduce, our performance reduces. And what happens to unaware leaders? They push
Yeah.
harder, which increases
Mm-hmm.
stress, which decreases the prefrontal cortex. It's a vicious cycle.
Yeah, it's so interesting because I talk about this when I talk about change with leaders, when I try to help them to understand change, because changes can also be seen as a threat, which kicks in that exact cycle that you've talked about. And so really talking to them to help them understand that when you propose change, it's going to cause stress, and that's going to cause them to not think as reasonably, as rationally as they normally might. And so really working to decrease that stress level so that they can actually engage their cognitive function. So that's exactly what you're talking about.
Yeah, and a big problem with change is not only does it increase stress and decrease the executive functions, we were born with one fear, just one, and that's fear of the unknown.
Hmm.
And if where an organization is headed and what the effect of that change is going to be is unclear, we are headed into the unknown.
Hmm.
And so fear comes up. It's a natural response. You're born with it, you're going to die with it. It's a survival mechanism. So if change is unclear, fear is a natural response. It's an unavoidable response.
Hmm.
And where there's fear, there's stress, and where there's stress, there's low function.
Yeah, absolutely. Sherry, this has been such an interesting conversation, and we could just go on and on, but I want to be respectful of time. I want to ask, how do people get a hold of you in case they want to continue the conversation or use your services? What's the best way to get a hold of you?
Well, you can reach me at Sherry, Sherry, like the wine, at Star Performance Systems, and that's systems plural, starperformancesystems.com.
Mm-hmm. And I always want to ask everyone that comes in the show, because I have such great experts in the show, what's a tip that you have to share with the audience? Because as you mentioned right now, there's just a lot going on and a lot of changes going on in the business environment. What's a tip that you have to share with us?
I would say for leaders, the best thing they can do is not assume what their people want. Ask. So if you're
Mm-hmm.
assuming that people want something, it odds are 80% that you're going to be wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ask them what listen, and then listen.
I like that the asking, because then that'll give you some insights into what their values are and what their motivations are, right? Being very explicit in terms of what they want and what they need in order to be successful. I like that.
And it doesn't take as much time as most people assume it will. I mean, in 10 minutes, you can know what's important to an individual if you're asking the right questions.
Awesome.
I would just ask.
Well, Sherry, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been really educational and really insightful. So I appreciate your time.
And thank you. I appreciate your time too,
Awesome.
Dr. Wayde.
And to our listeners, thanks for listening. We hope you join us again next time.